Jesus went to the places that no one else was going. Jesus talked to the people that no one else was talking to. Jesus went to the places that nobody thought that he should be there as the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords and as the Messiah and as the Son of God. They didn't believe that, even though that some didn't believe that he was that. They didn't believe that in who he was and who he said he was, that he should be talking to the people that he was talking to. But yet he went there anyways. And when we look at our lives and we look at our table, who's welcome at our table and who's not welcome at our table? And it's not just a Christian thing. So if you sit in the room this morning and you are a believer in Christ, you are a follower of Jesus, I'm not even talking about it from the standpoint of a Christian thing this morning. I'm just talking about it from the standpoint of a people thing, a society thing. Like, man, what if our tables just look different than us? What if I hung out with some people who weren't quite like me? What if I hung out with some people that may not be in their same spot that I'm in my faith walk with Christ? Maybe they're not even a Christian at all. Would I be influenced by the way that they live their lives, or could I influence them to lead them to maybe where I'm at in my walk with Christ? Like, it's not just a Christian thing, but it's just a people thing, a society thing for us to look at our tables and who's sitting at them. But for those of us in the room that are followers of Christ, for those of us in the room that would say, hey, I'm a Christian, I'm a follower of Jesus, I don't get it all right, but I'm trying to do the best that I can, our lives have to look differently. Our table should look differently. Because the world is looking at us to judge them. The world is waiting for us as the Christian people with the Christian ball cap on to say, hey, well, I can't talk to you, co-worker, because I know you go to church and I've got a nasty, disgusting past and I don't even think that you would want to talk to me, or I make a lot of mistakes in my life and so I don't know that you would really want anything to do with me. Or, hey, I know that you go to church, but I don't really want to talk to you. Or, hey, I know that you don't look like me or act like me and you have different interests in me, so I don't really know that we have anything in common, so we can't. So the world is looking for us as the church and as the followers of Jesus sometimes to kind of turn our nose up to them and turn away from them, so to speak. But man, when we're talking about coming to the table, and Jesus giving us this invitation that we all have, some of us have accepted it, some of us have not. Or if we have an invitation and we've taken the invitation and we're sitting at the table and we're wondering, hey, what do we do with that invitation? But today it's all about this idea of who is sitting at our table. Who's invited to come sit at the table that we're sitting at? And today we're going to look at a story that many of you may be familiar with. If you grew up in Sunday school or you grew up in church, you will probably be familiar with the story. If you're new to church, then you may not, or if you may not be familiar with the story. But either way, here's what I know. That the way that we view this story, the way that we see this story, I believe could change our lives and it could change the lives of other people around us. And so if you have your Bibles today, I want you to turn to John chapter 4. In John chapter 4. It's a story that we share often here at CityPlace, and the reason why we share it so often is that when we get ready to start a church, or so many churches come up with their name, or they come up with their purpose statement, or they come up with their vision statement, and they have this verse that goes along with what they're wanting to do or what they feel called to do. We don't have a church verse, so to speak, that goes along with our purpose of giving people a place to belong and to connect and to grow. But we have a story, and this is our story. When I read the story, when we preach from this story, probably once a year, it gives me this idea of what it is that we're called to do, what it is that we're supposed to do. But today, I want to look at it in a little bit of different light than we've looked at it in the past. And so in John chapter 4, I'm going to begin reading in verse 1, and here's what it says. It says, "Now when Jesus learned that the Pharisees had heard that Jesus was making and baptizing more disciples than John, although Jesus himself did not baptize, but only his disciples, he left Judea and he departed again for Galilee. And he had to pass through Samaria, so that he came to a town of Samaria called Sychar, near the field of Jacob, or the field that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there, and so Jesus, wearied as he was from his journey, was sitting beside the well, and it was about the 6th hour, which would be noon. So stop there for just a minute, because I want to set up the story for you guys today, like I often try to do, so that we can understand where we're headed for today. Jesus and his disciples, things are getting a little bit sketchy. Things are getting a little bit, there's some tension building in the place. There's some tension building that the Pharisees are getting a little bit frustrated because Jesus has baptized more people than John, even though Jesus himself wasn't baptizing anybody. And there's some tension building, and there's some things happen. So Jesus decides, hey, we're going to leave and we're going to get out of town. And so they go to head from Judea to Galilee to go back to where Jesus' kind of hometown is. And John tells us very specifically in the scripture, he tells us that Jesus had to go through Samaria. That he had to go through Samaria. And I find it interesting because if you know anything about geography, and you guys may not know this, so I'm going to share this with you, he didn't have to go through Samaria. That other Jews that would take the same journey that Jesus was taking from Judea down to Galilee, that they didn't have to go through Samaria. They purposely would avoid Samaria because, as we've shared many times before, the Jews and the Samaritans don't like each other very much. There's no friendship there. They don't like each other. They hate each other. And the Jews want nothing to do with the Samaritans. They don't want to be near them. They don't want to be in their city. They don't want to be in their town. They don't want to touch them. They don't want to have anything to do with them. And so a normal Jew that would take this journey from Judea to Galilee would skirt on the outside of Samaria. The Jordan River runs kind of on the east side of this, and they would go to the other side of the river and work their way down and skip by Samaria to get to Galilee. I shared with our volunteers this morning in our pre-service that it would be like the idea of you trying to go from Orlando to Tampa and deciding that you don't want to go through Lakeland because you don't like Lakeland. So you're going to work your way from Orlando to Tampa, and you're going to take the longest way around that you can get to kind of skip by Lakeland. It may not be right as far as mileage and geographic, but it gives us a visual of what they're trying to do. But John tells us specifically that Jesus had to go through Samaria. And I believe that from the very beginning of the story, it tells us something that we sometimes will overlook and that sometimes we'll pass. That Jesus is telling us something even by the path that he took in the story. That other Jews wouldn't go through Samaria, but Jesus would purposely go through Samaria. And so Jesus, full of intention, went to the place that others would avoid. Jesus' full attention in this moment, because he knows what's about to happen as we continue reading in the story, was that he had to be in Samaria. He had to go to the well that we're going to see in a minute. He was full of intention to head towards Samaria, so he would go to the place that other people would avoid. And I think that he sets an example for us in that. And so let's keep reading in verse 7. A woman from Samaria came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." For his disciples had gone away into the city to buy food. And the Samaritan woman said to him, "How is it that you, a Jew, ask for a drink from me, a woman of Samaria?" For Jews had no dealings with Samaritans. And Jesus answered her, "If you knew the gift of God and who it is that is saying to you, 'Give me a drink,' you would have asked him, and he would have given you living water." And the woman said to him, "Sir, you have nothing to draw water with, and the well is deep. Where do you get that living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob? He gave us this well and drank from it himself, as did his sons and his livestock." And Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again, but whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never be thirsty again. The water that I will give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life." And the woman said to him, "Sir, give me this water. Sir, give me this water so that I will not be thirsty or have to come here again, or come here to draw water." So Jesus works his way from Judea to Galilee. He works his way into town. It tells us that he's there at the 6th hour, which would be about noon. And there's some significance piece to the story that the woman comes at noon. I don't know if any of you guys have ever had the opportunity to go over to this area, to go to the Middle East. I have not. I'm hoping one day to be able to take a trip to Israel. But I do know this, that in the Middle East at noon, it's hot, right? I mean, we live here in Florida with summers and our heat, and I don't really like it, and some of you do, and that's fine. But then the Middle East at noon, it is hot and it is nasty, and it is not the time that most people would go to the well to get the water from there. They would go early in the morning, or maybe later in the evening when it was cooler, they would make this journey to the well to get the water. But there was a significant part of this woman's life that led her to the well at noon. And the reason why I believe she's there at noon is because nobody else would be there. She knew that no one else would be there. And we're going to see in a minute, if you're familiar with the story, you know. If you're not familiar with the story, we're going to see in a moment that Jesus and her have a conversation about her past. And I believe that she is ashamed. I believe that she is defeated by her past. And she's there at the well at noon because nobody else would be there that could judge her, that could condemn her, could gossip about her, could talk about her. She's there at this weird, this moment or this moment in time where no one else would be there, for the reason that I believe is because she's ashamed and defeated by the past that Jesus is going to talk to her about in just a moment. But how often are we like this woman at the well? Ashamed and defeated by our past, avoiding God and avoiding others because we feel unworthy and unaccepted by the society and unaccepted by people, and God could never love me, and God could never use me, and God could never do anything with me. And so we feel kind of ashamed and defeated by our own past, feeling unworthy. That we're so much just like the woman at the well at noon. Let's pick back up in the story. Verse 16. Jesus said to her, "Go call your husband and come here." So it's interesting, right? Let me stop there for a second. Jesus and this woman have this whole conversation. He says, "Hey, give me a drink of water." And she's like, "Sir, why are you, a Jewish man, talking to me, a woman of Samaria?" A Jew wouldn't even have talked to a woman really at this time. Women aren't that high in society at this time. They're looked down upon. And so a Jewish man probably wouldn't even had a conversation with a woman, much less a Samaritan woman. So the fact that Jesus is talking to a woman is socially kind of not a good thing. Culturally not a good thing. The fact that he's talking to a woman of Samaria is even worse. This shouldn't be happening. Jesus shouldn't be talking to this woman. And they begin to have this whole conversation about, "Give me a drink of water." And she's like, "Well, you don't have anything to draw water." He's like, "Well, if you drink the water that I have, it's living water, and you'll have eternal life forever. And this is what you're talking about." And she's a little bit confused by what Jesus is asking, and she's a little confused by what he's saying. And her thing is, when Jesus is talking about salvation and giving her living water and her life ever overflowing, she's like, "You don't even have anything to draw water with. Dude, I got a bucket. You don't even have a bucket, right? How are you going to get this living water that you're talking about, right?" How often is Jesus giving us direction and giving us things for our lives, and we just avoid it and ignore it and don't see exactly what it is he's trying to say? She's thinking literally, "You don't have anything to draw the water out of the well, so how can you give me any kind of living water? And who are you to give us living water? Are you greater than our father Jacob? He drank from this well. His livestock drank from this well. His family drank from this well. Are you greater than him?" Jesus is like, "Whoever drinks of the water that you have is going to be thirsty. But man, if you drink of the water that I have, you'll never be thirsty again." And I don't know in that moment if she exactly knew what Jesus was talking about. I don't know if she was just thinking about the idea man, I could drink some of this water that you have and I'll never be thirsty again. That sounds pretty good to me because I don't really like being thirsty, and it's noon and it's hot at the well and I just walked here with a bucket. So sure, I'll take whatever water you have. Sir, give me this water. But it's significant in the story that as Jesus tells her the salvation and he tells her exactly what he can offer to her, before they can get to that part, he has to deal with the stuff that is in her past. And that's where the question comes in verse 16 that I just read. Jesus said to her, "Go call your husband and come here." And the woman answered him, I have no husband. And Jesus said to her, "You are right in saying, I have no husband. For you have had 5 husbands, and the one that you have now is not your husband. What you have said is true." In the words of my daughter Michaela, get some sunblock because you just got burned, right? And the woman said to him, "Sir, I perceive that you are a prophet. Our fathers worshipped on this mountain, but you say that in Jerusalem is the place where people ought to worship." Notice how she's kind of changing the subject a little bit. Ever done that? Uncomfortable in a conversation and tried to change the subject? And Jesus said to her, "Woman, believe me. The hour is coming when neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem will you worship the Father. You worship what you do not know. We worship what we know, for salvation is from the Jews. But the hour is coming, and it is now here, when the true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship Him. God is spirit, and those who worship Him must worship in spirit and truth." And the woman said to him, "I know that Messiah is coming, He who is called Christ. When He comes, He will tell us all things." And Jesus said to her, "I who speak to you am He." Before Jesus can lead her to the future that He has for her, He has to deal with her past. Before Jesus can lead you to the future that He has for you, He has to deal with your past. But what I love so much about this idea of coming to the table and who is sitting at our table and the people that we invite to our table, I believe that when we see this story and we view this story in a different way, which we're gonna get there in just a moment, when we view this story in a different way, we understand that regardless of your past, Jesus still gives you a seat at the table. That no matter what you've done, no matter how much you've messed up, no matter what your past looks like, no matter how many mistakes there are, no matter how much you have just can't get it right, that if you will just accept the love and the forgiveness that Jesus offers you, that there is an invitation at the table for you. And so often we overlook this, that Jesus is giving us a seat at the table. But hear me when I say this. That your past is not getting in the way of the invitation to come and sit at the table, nor is it getting in the way of you accepting it. That your past isn't getting in the way of the invitation for you to come and sit at the table. Because so often I think that, like this woman at the well who's there at noon because she doesn't want anyone to see her and anyone to judge her and anyone to condemn her, she's there at this really odd time. That when Jesus gives us an invitation to come sit at the table, so often we don't think that we're worthy of it. We don't think that we can sit there. We don't think that we can accept it. Jesus, you don't know all that I've done. And He's like, yes, I do. And I know what you're going to do tomorrow, which is scary. I know everything that's happened in your life. I know all that you've done. And so often in our lives, we feel like our past is getting in the way of us sitting at the table when Jesus is telling us that it's not. And not only is it not getting in the way of us getting the invitation in the first place, it's not even getting in the way of us accepting it, because I think that's where many people fail. Well, I know Jesus offers love, and I know that He offers forgiveness. I think I get it. I mean, that's what the pastor was talking about this morning. But man, I'm just so unworthy, I can't accept the invitation. But regardless of your past, it's not getting in the way of any of that. Man, I struggle with alcohol, doesn't matter. I've struggled with drugs, doesn't matter. I've struggled with pornography, it doesn't matter. I've struggled with this. I've struggled with gossip. I've struggled with lying. I've struggled with this. I've struggled with that. You name the list of things that we all may struggle with, because all of us have different struggles. Whether you are a follower of Jesus or whether you are not, we all have struggles in our lives. We all have sins that we battle. We all have things that we're struggling with. But regardless of that, regardless of the past, if we will accept the love and the forgiveness that Jesus gives us, we all have a seat at the table. And Jesus offers her this seat at the table. He tells her, man, if you drink of this water that I give you, like, you will never be thirsty again. But man, before you can drink of this water, let's deal with the fact that you've had 4 husbands and now you're living with a man who's not your husband. Go get your husband. Oh, sir, I don't have a husband. He's like, I know. The guy that you're living with is not your husband, and the 4 guys before that, right? Like, whew. Can you imagine being face to face with Jesus? And he's like, yeah, Kevin, well, I know, but let's list these things. I'm like, oh, you knew about that? Oh, okay. Like, he just lays it all out there for her. And she's uncomfortable. She's a little uncomfortable with what's happening, and she tries to change the subject about, well, how do we worship? And I thought this is how we were going to worship, and I don't really want to talk about my past, so can we just talk about something else? Like, that would be great. Whoever you are, prophet man, right? But Jesus leads her back to a spot. Well, she's like, well, listen, this is all great. This is the way that I interpret this. This is strictly just my interpretation of this story. That as we wind down to verse 25 and 26, she's like, well, it's great. Like, you know everything that's happened in my past, and you're obviously a prophet from God, and you know a whole lot, and you're talking about living water, and it's kind of interesting what you're talking about, but I know at some point that the Messiah, the one that they call the Christ, is supposed to come back. So when he gets here, we'll just confirm everything that you've just said with him. Like, you know a lot, and you're really smart, and I don't know how you know my past, but when Christ gets here, we'll just confirm that with him. And Jesus is like, the one who speaks to you is he. And here's the idea where we tie in our pasts and our failures and the things that we're ashamed of, and understanding that regardless of that if we will accept the love and forgiveness that Jesus gives, we still have a seat at the table. And me asking you the question of who is sitting at your table where these two things come together. Is that when we begin to understand that regardless of your past, that we have a seat, then I believe that we will then begin to realize that everyone else has a seat at the same table. That when we begin to see and understand that regardless of our past, that we have a seat, then we begin to realize that everyone else has a seat at the same table. Because when we see as Jesus sees, then everyone is welcome. Because if you keep reading in the story, and you can finish reading some of it this week on your own if you want, the very next verse when Jesus says, hey, I the one that am speaking to you, I am he, I am the Christ, I am the Messiah, I am the Son of God. The next verse that John gives us is that the disciples walked back up. The disciples had gone back into town to find some lunch. Jesus sent them on a journey so that he could have this conversation with this woman. And the disciples walk back up on this conversation with Jesus at the well with the Samaritan woman. And the scriptures tell us that they were a little bit confused, and no one wanted to say anything, and no one wanted to call out Jesus, and no one wanted to ask Jesus, why are you talking to the Samaritan woman? Like, you shouldn't be doing this. The story gets kind of weird in that moment. Jesus drops this truth on her, and then the disciples walk up. They didn't think that she should be there. They didn't think she had a seat at the table. She's a Samaritan woman. She's like the bottom of the totem pole. She's on the bottom of their sandals, so to speak. Like, Jesus of all people definitely shouldn't be sitting at the well talking to this woman. She doesn't have a seat at the same table that we have. She's not welcome at the same table that we're welcome at. Like, we're his followers. We're his disciples. Like, why is he talking to this woman? And but when we begin to see as Jesus sees, then we begin to understand that everyone in that moment is welcome. We often talk about here at church that it's not about the place you're coming, but about the places that you're going. This is why that phrase that has been with our church since the day we opened our doors, this is why the story resonates so true with me with the vision of our church. Jesus gave her a place to belong. Jesus gave her a place to connect. Jesus gave her a place to grow because he led her to Christ. And then we see in the story what happens if you keep reading. It tells us that once the woman begins to understand who Jesus was, she takes off running back into town, leaving her water jar. Like, it's an interesting fact that John wrote that into the story. That she leaves her water jar, which is the whole reason why she was there in the first place. And how often in our lives do we have one agenda, but God has another? And he uses that moment to change our lives, or change our course, or change our future. This woman brought her water jar and got to the well at noon on whatever day it was on, because she knew no one else would be there at that time because it was so hot outside. Has this whole conversation with Jesus. He changes the course of her life forever. And she's so excited about the fact that Jesus just changed her life and that he knows about her past and he knows everything that there is that she's ever done, that she's so excited about the fact that God just changed her life that she leaves the water jar, the whole purpose of why she was there in the first place, and runs back in town to tell everybody that she found Jesus. Have you ever been that excited about what God has done in your life? Have you ever been that excited? Like, usually when you first give your life to Christ, and those of you that are followers of Jesus, like if you've been following him for some time, or maybe you're a brand new Christian, whatever it means, like when you first usually give your life to Christ, like that is when most people are the most excited. Like, bro, I just gave my life to Jesus. I got baptized last weekend. Like, it's just crazy. And some of your friends are like, you're weird now. I don't want to talk to you, right? That happened to me. I went from being the leader of the pack, partying on the weekends, to now I love Jesus. And my friends are like, dude, you're really weird and we can't talk to you anymore. All right, whatever, that's fine. But like, have you ever been that excited that you just leave your water jar and just run back into town? And she runs back into town and she tells everybody, hey, the Christ, the Messiah, he told me everything that I've ever done. Like, she's excited about that. Think about that. I'm not running up to you going, hey, it was really awesome. I was praying today and I had this conversation with Jesus and he just listed all of my sins. Let me share them with you, right? Who does that? Like, she leaves her water jar and she runs back into town and tells everybody exactly who Jesus is and exactly what Jesus has done in her life. She shares with everyone that Jesus has given her a seat at the table. And that everyone is welcome. Is everyone welcome at your table? Or when you think about your table, who is sitting at your table? Jesus knew this day that she would be at the well. He knew she would be at the well, just like he knew that you would be here today. He knew she was going to be at the well. That's why they had to go through Samaria. Because he wanted this appointment with this woman at the well so he could change her life. And just like he knew she was going to be there, he knew that you were going to be right here. He knows how you're doing spiritually. He knows how you're doing physically. He knows how you're doing emotionally. The question is, are we ready for that? Are we ready for him? The woman's past is forgiven and she now has this seat to the table. And she runs back into town, and you read in verse 41 and 42. You read in verse 41 and 42 in the story. She runs back into town. She tells everybody, man, I met the Christ and he told me everything that I need to do and he told me everything that I am. And she changes the course of the city. She changes her city. She runs into town and changes everything. And the other Samaritans come and they tell Jesus, hey, listen, we are believing in you now, not because of the woman's testimony, but because we have seen and heard you teach, and we've seen you for ourselves. But it all started because the woman runs back into town. The woman runs into the city to tell everybody about who Jesus is and how he's changed her life. You have to come see the Christ, the Messiah. You have to come. He gave me a seat at the table. Come and see what he's all about. And they come and they hear and they listen. And the course of a city is changed. And I believe that for each of you, myself included, that we have an opportunity to change our city. When we planted a church 2 years ago, the idea was, man, there are 200,000 people in the city of Lakeland who don't have a relationship with Christ. And I was asked the question often, does Lakeland really need another church? I said, yeah, I believe they do. Because with all the churches that are in the city of Lakeland, and I'm not bad-mouthing any church, all I'm saying is with all the churches in the city of Lakeland, there's still 200,000 people who don't have a relationship with Jesus. We need all the churches we can get. That's why I want to plant more churches at some point. Here, wherever. We raise up a group of church planters that want to go out into the world and share the gospel with people and lead people to Christ, whether it's here or Seattle or Honduras, like wherever. But man, we planted a church here because this is where we felt God was calling us to. And 200,000 people that don't have a relationship with Jesus. This one woman, her life is forever changed. She's so excited that she leaves the water jar and she runs back into town. Excited about the invitation that Jesus has given her at the table. She doesn't care about her past. She doesn't care about anything else. The only thing she cares about is that her life is forever changed. And that's why I'm saying that when we see as Jesus sees, then everyone should be welcome at our table. And so when we look at our lives, where are we? Are we so ashamed of our past that we don't think we're worthy of an invitation? Have we been invited and we're ignoring it? Are we sitting at the table and doing nothing with it? If you sit in the room this morning and you are a follower of Jesus, I challenge you this week to look at your table. Who's at your table? It was hard for me this week because I'm like, these are the group of people that I normally hang out with. And our lives should be diverse. Our church should be diverse. Our city is diverse. And I don't mean diverse like, hey, I just need a couple friends that are a different race than me. Like, I'm just saying, like, what does it look like? This isn't a race thing for me. When I say diverse, don't hear race from me. Because there's a lot of people that are white that are completely different than me that I have nothing in common with that I could invite and sit at my table just as much as I could someone who's Latino or black or whatever. This isn't a race thing. But when I sit back and I look at my table and I go, man, Jesus invited me in. Like, I was the last person. You guys know my story. Like, this is the last place that I thought I would be is in church. And like, Jesus radically changed my life. And so my table should be inviting people to that invitation. I'm not saying, hey, you go out this weekend and go hang out in the bars this weekend and try to share your testimony with people in the bar. I could never do that. Why? Because I struggle with alcohol. So if I walk into a bar, that temptation could fall for me. So I'm not doing that. That may not be a temptation for you. If you struggle with pornography, then I'm not asking you to go start a group that tries to reach into people and you find your temptation there. Whatever it may be, I'm not asking you to do something that you could get yourself in trouble. But what I'm saying is, man, let's just take a step back and look at our tables and say, hey, man, are we welcoming everyone to our table? Because Jesus welcomed her. And she didn't care about her past. She didn't care about anything. All she wanted was the invitation that Jesus offered her. And so there's two parts this morning. One is the fact that Jesus radically changed this girl's life, this woman's life. She didn't know who Jesus was. And He shares salvation with her. Man, if you will just come drink what I'm part of, if you will just come take part of what I have, man, you'll never be thirsty again. It doesn't mean you're not going to have struggles. It doesn't mean that you're not going to have hard times in your life. It doesn't mean that you're not going to have any of these things. But man, if you'll just come drink of the water that I offer, I promise you that your life will be better. Maybe that's you this morning. Maybe you just need to drink of that salvation that He so freely offers. But on the other end of it, for those of us that are followers of Jesus, that have already made that decision to follow Him with our lives, then the challenge for you this week is to look at your table and to grow your circle. Look at your table this week and grow your circle. All of us work with somebody, mostly, or have a neighbor that we normally probably wouldn't hang out with. Invite them to your house for dinner this week. Go to lunch with that person at work that you don't normally go to lunch with because they kind of get on your nerves, right? Maybe they're a Christian, maybe they're not. Maybe you invite them to church. We're making a big push to take invite cards and invite people for Easter. And I don't want it just to be an Easter thing. I want it to be a church culture thing. Like, let's always be inviting people to church. That's why invite cards are on the connections table. It makes it really easy. If you're uncomfortable asking someone to come to church, just hand them an invite card. It says you're invited on the front of it, right? It takes all the awkwardness out of it for you. So we're making this big push towards Easter, but if we're a follower of Jesus, then let's look at our table and grow our circles this week. And so I want to ask you to close your eyes and bow your heads for me this morning.